Hi, Scott from Digital Fish with content that catches and a video on tips on what to do when the fishing is hard when you're boat fishing. You might have caught my last video when I talked about rock fishing tips when things were hard, so check that out if you're more of a shore-based fisherman. So tip number one, if you're out there with soft baits or jigs, it's actually quite helpful to try and figure out what the fish are feeding on. For example, there's schools of bait fish around and you identify them as anchovies, then using smaller brown lures are going to help you get a feed. So tip number two, if you're out fishing and you're lure fishing with soft baits or jigs and the conditions are calm and clear and the water is clear, then it's a good idea to actually try more natural coloured lures because the fish have a fair amount of time to see your lure and reject it. The opposite is quite true as well. So if it's a dull, overcast day or the water is quite murky, then using larger and brighter coloured lures can sometimes be the trick to switch them on and get them to strike. Also helps them to see the lure a bit more easily as well. Tip number three, again another lure fishing tip. If you're out there with a mate, it's good to mix it up with your lure. So you might be fishing a larger lure and they may be fishing a smaller lure. Mix it up so that you're covering a few different bases. It's good if you're by yourself, you've got a couple of rods out and you could have one with a jig, one with a soft bait. But mixing it up can be a really good idea until you start to see a pattern emerging if the fish are favouring one over the other. Tip number four, if you're bait fishing, make sure you're working the burley and that it's doing a good job. And make sure the burley is set at the right depth as well. You want the burley and your bait to be hitting the strike zone or the bottom at about the same time. So if it's shallow water, you can set the burley shallower, but if the current's really strong, you want to put the burley closer to the bottom. Otherwise, the burley will be a long way at the back of the boat before it hits the bottom where the fish are. But wherever it may be, you want your bait and the burley to be sort of in the same area, basically. Tip number five for bait fishing. If things are slow, instead of cutting your bait on a straight up and down, try and cut it on a diagonal so it exposes more flesh and therefore more oil and blood can leach out, especially true of pilchards. Tip number six, bait fishing again. If you're fishing shallow water, try and not make too much noise. If the fish are shy, then you'll scare them away real easily. So you may even want to consider drifting slowly up to position with the engine off and then very quietly lowering the anchor into position if you can. Again, don't drop stuff from the bottom of the boat like sinkers or rods or that sort of thing, or fish smashing around. That can scare fish away, especially if they're in a very shy, hesitant sort of mood. Tip number seven, in a boat it's easy to move around and try and look for the fish and find them. If you're getting halfway through the day and there's nothing really around, it may be a really good idea to figure out your best guess. Where's the most likely place to catch a fish? It could be structure, it could be somewhere you see some really good sound, and just stay put until the bite time comes on, or just persevere in that one area rather than continue to move all over the place. Once you see a spot that may be okay, then I'd suggest you sticking around and working, especially if you're working burley and you're trying to track the fish to where you are. Tip number eight, don't leave the fish to find the fish. If you're on a spot and it's doing okay, I'd be tempted to stay there instead of trying to go somewhere else. Many times I've started the day fishing and I thought, yeah, we're getting a few fish, but I think we can do better somewhere else. I've gone somewhere else and it wasn't any better. The first spot was actually the best. So don't leave the fish to find the fish. Maybe work that area a bit more, try some different lures, some different baits, bigger lures, different colours, maybe until you start to get a better quality of fish. But generally fish are in an area for a very good reason. There's food there, there's shelter, there's reason for them to be there. So if you are catching fish in a particular spot, I'd generally stay in that one area and keep working it. So there's my tips for what to do when the fishing is slow, if you're bait fishing or lure fishing. The tips that have helped me catch fish and put a few more fish in the bag, particularly on the very slow days, and getting bites. Better go. Good luck.